Please join me in welcoming Carl Zimmer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out in this terrible weather. I really appreciate it. I'm going to talk to you about age tonight, and I'm going to start off by showing my age. I saw this movie when it came out, and that was 31 years ago. So how many of you have seen it? Okay. All right, so for those of you who haven't, you are definitely in for a campy treat. Goldie Hawn and Meryl Streep, they chew up all the scenery. And what they're playing, two women who are tormented by our culture's dysfunctional obsession with ideals of feminine beauty and youth. And it makes them grotesque, as you can literally see in the poster. So on paper, when the movie came out in 1992, it should have been a hit. It had Goldie Hawn, it had Bruce Willis, it had Meryl Streep, directed by Robert Zemeckis, who was coming off a string of big hits like Back to the Future. But the movie was just too weird. Its co-writer, David Koepp, he told Vanity Fair that he originally had in mind a low-budget B movie. The way he described it was Night of the Living Dead if George Cukor made it. So instead, what he and his co-writer Martin Donovan ended up with was actually a big Hollywood production, which was then marketed to the multiplexes, and it tanked, completely tanked, and didn't get much love from critics. Koepp was very stoic about it, about the experience. He said, "You can't have a life in the circus without a certain amount of elephant shit." But, it's interesting, a movie about aging and death has had quite an afterlife. It has become a cult classic, especially within the queer community. And it's definitely, if you haven't watched it since 1992 and you're straight and you weren't aware of this, like myself, this is definitely worth a spin around the internet to understand just how much this movie has come to mean to so many people. This is Jarek Hofer in a drag persona of Jinx Monsoon, and she did a whole photo shoot reenacting Death Becomes Her. In a documentary, Hofer actually talks about reciting Meryl Streep's lines at age 7. So this means a lot. And the cis straight writers of this movie, David Koepp and Martin Donovan, had no idea why this was happening, but they were very happy. Koepp said, "You really can't underestimate the entertainment value of two women swinging shovels at each other." Donovan was totally stumped. He said, "I could invent some excuse, but deep down in my heart, I don't know." And so he speculated that the gay community is often attracted to tales of struggle and resilience about people who are, quote, never giving up, even if it's a mess. And that's who these characters are in this movie. So if you have seen this movie, you might be wondering what I'm doing here. Why am I talking about science today? The fact is that it's also fun to watch this movie thinking about science, especially the science in 2023 as opposed to 1992, the science of aging. I'm not going to give away big spoilers, but I will just point out that early in the movie, Meryl Streep is very unhappy because she's getting older. And she's seeking help from Isabella Rossellini, and she's just sort of sighing because, she can't win. She can't win this fight because, getting older and the disappointments that come with it are a natural law. And what's interesting is that, biology doesn't have a lot of laws, but, maybe one of the things that is close to a law in biology is that we get old. Our bodies, go through a whole bunch of obvious changes. My hair is gray. It used to be black. Our skin gets wrinkled. Our lungs lose their capacity. Our immune systems get weaker. all sorts of very predictable things tend to happen as we get older. And so scientists have been trying to look for what's going on, what's happening at a molecular level. Is there something that can somehow unify all these different changes? And can we understand this process in a law-like way? So one interesting line of research involves these little molecules here that stick to our DNA. They're called methyl groups, and the attachment of them on our DNA is called methylation. And so there are millions of spots along your DNA where you have a methyl group stuck to it, or whole strings of them. And these are very important in terms of which genes in a given cell are turned on and which are turned off, which ones make proteins and which ones don't. And what's interesting is that your methylation pattern changes through life. So this is sort of a simplified diagram. So in an embryo, the DNA starts getting methylated in different places, and that's very important for the embryo to be able to develop into a human being. And those cells, as they divide, they carry on that mark, that signature of methylation in different places. So in this figure, the blue spots, imagine that those are methylated and the yellow are not. Things change over time. Sometimes the methyl groups get pulled off, when you're 20 or when you're 70. Sometimes they get attached in new places. So there's a gradual change that happens with methylation. And so scientists are really trying to figure out what's going on. What does that mean? How is the methylation pattern affecting our bodies as we get older? Or is it just a sign of some other process? It's hard to know, but what does seem to be clear is that those of you who are still enjoying life in your 20s, your methylation patterns are kind of similar to each other. Those of you who are like me in your 50s, you have a somewhat different one. And so it's actually possible to just zero in on, say, just a few thousand of these sites and see, are they methylated or not? And you can actually train a computer, say, okay, here are a bunch of people who are 20 and 25 and 30 and so on. You train a computer, and eventually the computer will be able to recognize pretty well how old someone is just based on their methylation. So this is a graph that is based on saliva and blood cells. So if we took George O'Keeffe when she's about 34, she would have a methylation pattern that would predict her age pretty close to her actual age, within a couple years, plus or minus. And that same person, in her 90s, will have a different methylation pattern over there. And so there's something going on, perhaps law-like, with this biology. This is my cat, Mick, and Mick is 10. So you could take Mick's saliva and you could actually predict Mick's age within less than a year. There seems to be something quite universal going on, not just in humans, but in all mammals. It might even work in frogs. There seems to be something going on. Methylation is telling us something important about age, and age seems to be inescapable. What's interesting, of course, is that different species live to different ages. An elephant will live as long as people or longer, whereas, a mouse might just live a couple years at most. But you can still predict how old a mouse is based on this epigenetic clock, this methylation pattern. And it might have something to do with how our biology is running. So, animals that only live a couple years, they're living fast. They have to reproduce fast because they're going to be dying young. There are different evolutionary strategies: live fast, die young; live slow, die old. But somehow underneath it all, this epigenetic clock is still ticking away. So this is actually like for people who study, say, polar bears. This is so exciting because it used to be, in order to figure out how old polar bears are, you had to pull a tooth. So they no longer have to pull polar bear teeth. They can, right now, they can, starting this year, they are drawing blood to estimate the age of polar bears, and they think they can get it to work with saliva within a couple years. So there are all sorts of interesting applications that come of this. And there's also, potentially something important stuff about medicine to be learned from this epigenetic clock. Because, when I showed you that graph, it wasn't just a perfect line, it was a cloud. And so what that means is that, some people fall right on that average line where your epigenetic clock matches your chronological clock. But then, take an example like the red dot there. There you've got someone who's the same chronological age as the blue dot below and the green dot below that, but has this sort of older biological age. Whereas the green dot, that's someone who seems to is younger if you just looked at their methylation patterns. So what does that mean? Well, it does actually seem to mean something. I mean, scientists are still figuring out what it all means, but what seems to be happening is that if your epigenetic clock is above your chronological age, that means that your body is getting closer to death. Your clock is running a little faster, and actually this is not a figure of speech. If you look at people and who have an epigenetic age that's older than their chronological age, their risk of dying, just of any cause, is higher than people who have a younger epigenetic age. What exactly this means, again, it's not clear, but there are some interesting patterns in terms of what can accelerate aging. So HIV, for example, people who have HIV infections and manage it with medications, they can live a fairly long life. But if you look at their epigenetic clock, it's as if they're about 5 years older. Smoking can also do this. There are lots of other things that can accelerate the clock. So you might be wondering, what's my epigenetic age? And of course, there are people here in the Boston area who would love to sell you something to find out. So you should recognize that box, because I just showed it to you. They will actually take a sample from you and try to estimate will give you your biological age, in other words, your epigenetic clock. Now, you have to look for it, but just bear in mind that this biological age should not be used to determine or alter any age-related health or medical treatments based on your chronological age. So think of it as fun, think of it as a hobby, think of it as a learning experience. Do not start to pretend to be your own doctor based on this. And don't feel too smug if you find out you're a few years younger than your chronological age. We don't know enough about this stuff. If we did, maybe this natural law wouldn't necessarily be so natural. Isabella Rossellini, says in response to Meryl Streep, well, screw the natural law. And so she wants to offer something. She wants to change aging. She wants to fight back. She wants to offer this elixir. Bruce Willis in the movie, plays the sort of the professional age reverser, a plastic surgeon. At least, in the 1990s, that was really the main way that people would try to pretend that they were younger than they were. And so the idea at the time of somehow being able to transform yourself from within to get that youthful glow again, that was really, then you're starting to talk about magic. I love this line in the movie, "A touch of magic in this world obsessed with science." Of course, we use science in our obsessions about things like getting old. Again, like I showed you with that FDA warning, there's no clinically demonstrated way to reverse your epigenetic clock by downing a bunch of supplements. Obviously, don't smoke. If any of you are smoking, just stop. That is a great way to slow biological aging. But beyond that, would there be other ways of altering your biological clock? Well, there are experiments that do demonstrate that this is possible. And my favorite one is really perhaps the most grotesque experiment you can imagine. On the night where we're going to watch a grotesque movie, meet parabiosis. Parabiosis is a technique by which you sew together the circulatory system of two animals so that the blood goes from one animal to the other and back in one giant loop. And so what scientists have done is they've taken mice and they have connected a young mouse to an old mouse so that the old mouse is receiving a circulation of young blood. There have been a number of these experiments. I wrote over the summer about one which has been quite ambitious because usually they just connect them for maybe a week or two. These mice had to kind of walk around together, joined at the blood vessels for 3 months, which is a long time if you're a mouse. This diagram basically shows that they were combining two young mice together, two old mice together, and then a young and old mouse together. And then they would detach them, and then they would study them, and they would just basically just observe them and see how life went for them. And those old mice that were connected to young mice, they lived longer. So it's about 6 to 9% longer. It's statistically significant. That would be like giving, if you were connected to somebody, you might get an extra 6 years. And what's also interesting is that then you can look at the epigenetic clock on those old mice, and it's slower. It has run more slowly than the old mice who were just left on their own. So that clock has been tinkered with parabiosis. So we don't know what's happening. Again, we just don't know. Is it that they're like bad proteins in the old mice that are getting flushed out? Or is there some mysterious protein that's coming in from the young mouse that's rejuvenating the old mouse? We don't know, but whatever's happening is we're setting that epigenetic clock and letting the mice live longer. So it's fascinating. Maybe in 10, 20, 30 years, there will be some FDA-approved treatment that really does build on research like this to tackle aging, but it doesn't exist yet. It doesn't exist yet. It's only in the movies for now. Just to finish up before we start the movie, all the things that I was telling you about, they didn't, none of this is, all this came like 3 decades after the movie came out. And culturally, I think there's something interesting about, the 21st century battle against aging. In this movie, it's very much focused on women getting old. Bruce Willis, the straight man, accepts the ticking clock of age with grace and nobility. But we kind of know that men aren't really that great. And if you've seen Silicon Valley, you may remember the episode The Blood Boy. If you haven't seen it, you really need to check it out because it's literally like a comedy version of what I just told you about with tech bros. And life is imitating art in the sense that this is a guy named Brian Johnson who is insanely rich and is 46 years old and is determined to spend millions and millions of dollars to reverse his epigenetic clock and to try to live as long as he can. We all need to spend our money somehow. The only thing I will just say, just to close before we watch the movie, is that if Robert Zemeckis were to make a sequel to Death Becomes Her, I would suggest it should be called Death Becomes Him. So I thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy the movie.